Hi, I'm Jeremy, the Zoo Nerd, coming to you live from my backyard in beautiful Los Angeles, California. How's everybody doing today? I hope you're well, I hope you're happy, I hope you're healthy, and I hope you're staying safe, staying home, and being smart. Today's Critter Chat is going to be a little bit of a continuation from yesterday. Yesterday we spent a lot of time talking about the different types of otters. I focused a little more on the freshwater species of otters. Today we're going to talk about their distant cousins, the sea otter, and a little bit about a kind of strange otter that lives in South America called a marine otter that also spends most of its time in the ocean. But more on that species later. In working with sea otters, I've been able to observe them both in the wild and in an aquarium setting. I've been a big fan of them whenever I see them at a zoo or an aquarium or any other facility. I always take a lot of time to spend watching them, especially if they're awake and active and moving about. I find them very enjoyable to observe, and I think a lot of people feel similarly. They're quite cute, they're pretty energetic, especially in a zoo or an aquarium. They have a lot of free time, so they're quite curious, intelligent, and playful. Now, the sea otters specifically are the otters that live in the ocean in the North Pacific. So historically, that went from Baja, Mexico, all the way up through California, through Oregon, through Washington, through Canada, through Alaska, across the Aleutian Islands, and then on the other side of the ocean, along the coast of Russia, Japan, and Korea. They don't live in all those places anymore. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little further on. Today they are divided into three subspecies. So there's a subspecies that lives here in California called the southern sea otter. There is a species that lives in a little pocket just off the coast of Washington State and up through the middle of Alaska, through the Aleutian Islands a bit, and that's called the northern sea otter. And then there's the sea otter kind of on the far side over off the coast of Russia and Japan. That's sometimes referred to as the Russian sea otter. They're all pretty closely related, but there are some differences, especially size-wise and dietary, between those otters. The otters I'm most familiar with are the California sea otters, or the southern sea otters, and I will spend most of my time talking about them today. So a little recap from yesterday. They're kind of a medium-sized animal compared to other animals out there, but as far as otters are concerned, sea otters are the heaviest. So they're one of the biggest species, although their cousins in South America can get quite a bit, or can get a bit longer, with those guys being up to 6 feet in length. Sea otters typically are 4 feet in length. For females, males would be a little bit longer. And then in the northern range, so up in the Alaska subspecies, those would be a bit longer even still, probably in the 5.5 foot range for a big male. But when I say heavier, typically the smallest you would find a sea otter weight-wise is going to be around 40 pounds. And some of those big boys up near Alaska are going to be upwards of 90 pounds. So they can be quite dense and bulky. Now, they very rarely come up onto the land. Sea otters spend most of their time in the ocean. They are typically born in the ocean. They spend most of their time as a baby in the ocean. They spend most of their adult life in the ocean. In a zoo or an aquarium, you may see them on shore a bit more. That's because there's not threats that they would face up on the land in an aquarium or a zoo. In the wild, they would be much more vulnerable to predators or to harm from people if they were up on the ocean or up on the coast. And they kind of have an awkward way of moving when they're on land, primarily because of how their back feet are kind of adapted to a life in water. Their back feet are totally webbed, kind of like a duck's foot. So that's a little hard for them to walk. And then the way that their skeleton works, typically when they come out of the water, They don't walk on all 4 feet. They kind of pull themselves with their front feet and let their back feet drag behind them, which is not the most comfortable way of walking. And so they typically spend most of their time, like 99.9% of their time, in the ocean, in the water. Sea otters are pretty much solitary, and that's specifically their social interactions with other otters is kind of rare. It's not very common that they would have any tight social bond with any other otters. Now, they will sometimes be in the same area and they tolerate each other. They're not going to try to chase each other off or fight with each other. But if there's many otters in an area, it's because that's a good spot for lots of food, and they kind of tolerate each other being around. Other than if there's multiple males in that area, they will sometimes try to chase the others off because they want to be able to breed with as many females as possible, and they don't want the competition. Typically, a mom sea otter only has one baby, and then she raises that baby entirely by herself. The dad otter is long gone. He doesn't stick around, he doesn't help, he doesn't live with the mom. He's off on his own, exploring his own world and living his life. So she has a lot of work to do when the baby is born. Baby sea otters usually weigh between like 3 and 5 pounds, and they're covered in super fluffy fur that makes them extra buoyant to float really well. And that's because although the mom's holding on to the baby when she's up at the surface, she has to go find food for her so that she can feed the baby too. And when that happens, the baby needs to stay up on the surface and mom will go get food. So she'll sometimes wrap it in some seaweed, in some kelp, to kind of anchor the baby in place while she goes hunting. Now, sea otters, they have super dense fur, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but I'll recap in case you didn't catch that Critter Chat. By the way, full episodes are always uploaded to YouTube and Facebook afterwards, so you can go back and rewatch them, or if you missed one, go back and watch it, or if you missed part of it, go back and visit it there. But the sea otter's fur is super, super dense. Within about a 1-inch square, they have about 1 million hairs, which is very impressive. Humans, we usually have between like 60 and maybe 100,000 hairs on our whole head. So it would take like 10 to 15 humans to equal the amount of hair that one sea otter has in a square inch. And they have 2 kinds of hair. They have really short, soft hairs that are close to the skin, and then they have a little bit longer hairs, and they serve 2 different purposes. So those soft hairs, they really are tight together and they help to hold air bubbles, and that helps to keep them warm in the cold ocean. And the longer hairs, they kind of coat those with special oils and glands from their skin that help make them a little more waterproof. And those 2 things help to keep their fur a lot more waterproof, to keep them warm in a cold ocean. If any of you have ever been to a beach in California, you know the water's never that warm, right? Well, the further you go up the coastline, the colder that water gets. And the water in Central California, where the sea otters live, is quite chilly year-round. The weather there is also quite chilly year-round. It's not often that it's very warm or very clear. It's very cloudy, very foggy, and very chilly with a pretty strong wind most of the time. Sea otters, unlike other ocean-dwelling mammals, don't have a thick layer of fat. So that's what keeps seals, dolphins, whales warm out in the ocean. They have what we call blubber. And sea otters, they don't have that. So they need to stay warm in other ways. And one of those ways is their thick fur coat. So that helps to keep them waterproof. And often if you see a sea otter or any otter dive into water, you'll see a lot of bubbles coming out of its hair. And that's some of the air escaping. But there's still a lot of air trapped into those little fine, very soft hairs. And that helps insulate them to keep them warm. Now, to maintain that very luxurious fur coat, they spend a lot of time grooming. About 40% of their awake hours is spent grooming their fur. And they don't groom like a dog or a cat, so they don't lick their fur like those animals do. They kind of scratch it more with their paws. They'll kind of scratch up and down and rub it. They'll sometimes rub it on a rock, or if they're floating out in the water along the edge of a dock, sometimes against seaweed. And they'll kind of just make sure that they scratch everywhere to help get new air down into those little furs to help keep them warm. Now, sea otters also live very close to the coastline. They're usually less than a mile from the shoreline. Typically, the shoreline where they live is kind of more rocky, less sandy beach, although there are places where it is sandy. And they usually spend most of their time in water that's, for the ocean, not very deep, less than about 100 feet deep. Although they have been recorded diving as deep as 600 feet, they typically live and dive in water that is less deep than that. Sorry, had some connection issues. Hope we're back for everybody. Always fun, technology, right? So sea otters typically stay in water that's only about 100 feet deep, and that is a better place for them to find their food. They have a huge appetite. Sea otters spend about 40% of their time grooming and another 40% of their awake time hunting and eating food. They're good hunters. They go after things that don't move very fast mostly. So they typically are eating things that move pretty slow, easy to catch. But they eat about 1/4 of their body weight every day. So if you weighed about 100 pounds, you would have to eat 100 quarter-pound hamburgers every day to eat the same level that a sea otter eats. So that's a lot of food, right? And scientists have studied what the sea otters eat, and they've identified over 30 species of different things that they like to eat. So that's usually things like crabs, clams, snails, abalone, shrimp, octopus, squid, and urchins. So all of those are kind of slower moving for the most part. A lot of those have kind of a harder outer shell covering, and they all kind of live in an environment called the kelp forest. So under the water, the kelp, the giant seaweed, grows really, really tall, and a lot of those animals kind of hang out in, on, and under that seaweed, and the sea otters do a really good job of eating a wide variety of things that live in the kelp forest. Now, the southern sea otters, the ones here in California, they do not eat fish. The fish are usually very fast. The sea otters are a little bit slower, and they don't spend time chasing fish when there's so many other good things that they can catch and eat that's a little easier for them. Now, some of the sea otters that are a bit bigger up in Alaska and over by Russia, they do eat fish. Maybe those fish move slower. I don't know. I don't know for sure why those eat fish and the California ones don't, but it's how it is. But as I was saying, they eat a wide variety of food, and they eat about 1/4 of their body weight every day. And so what that means is that they burn through a lot of calories. They have a really high metabolism. Kind of if you know anybody who's an athlete or who works out a lot, they need to eat a lot more food than someone who's maybe a little more lazy or a little more slow in their lifestyle. And with that higher metabolism, they're burning all those calories. They stay really warm in that water. Most sea otters have an internal body temperature of near 100 degrees, despite the fact that most of the water they're in most of the time is usually in the 50s or 40s. So it seems to work fairly well for them. Now, when sea otters hunt their food, they bring it up to the surface. They don't eat it underwater. That's because they can only hold their breath for about 5, maybe 6 or 7 minutes. So they come back up to the surface to eat, and they usually float on their back and kind of put the food on their chest. That's their table. And if it's something with a hard shell, like clams or a crab or urchins, they may have a tool that they keep with them to help break open those shells. That tool is sometimes a shell or sometimes a rock, and they actually have a little built-in pocket where they keep their tool. They don't want to have to find a tool every time they find that kind of food, So if they're a sea otter that eats a lot of that food, they will usually keep their tool in a little pocket kind of in their armpit where there's an extra fold of skin, and they can kind of keep their rock or their shell right in there, and it will stay there while they're swimming. And then when they come back up to the surface, they can pull that up and beat the crab or the clam open with that rock. That's pretty amazing. There's not a lot of animals out there that use tools. That's usually saved. Scientists usually identify that more as something that primates do. So monkeys, apes, definitely people. So sea otters are kind of a unique exception to that outside the primate family that uses tools, but they are very adept at using their tools, and when they eat a lot of those animals, they keep a tool handy. Let's see. Okay, so we talked a little bit about their fur and how it's very important to the sea otters. It is also why they got into a lot of trouble. In the 1700s, when people were first kind of exploring the western coast of the United States, and they were coming around with big boats and floating up and down the coastline, it was said that in some places the sea otters were so thick, there were so many of them, that they had to push them out of the way with an oar to get to the shore. But they soon learned that the sea otter's fur was very, very warm, very dense, very soft, and also had some waterproof qualities. Now, back in the 1700s, we didn't have clothing like this, and people wanted warm clothes to be able to stay warm during wintry times, and they would pay a lot of money for a warm hat or a warm coat. And so sea otter fur became a very hugely valuable commodity, and with that, people started to hunt sea otters. And it wasn't just like one guy out in a boat hunting sea otters. There were companies out hunting sea otters to get their fur coats. And within about 100 years of them being discovered, they were almost wiped out. In fact, they thought for a long time that they had killed all the sea otters south of like Alaska by the early 1900s. In 1911, they put a ban on hunting sea otters. They realized that there were not so many of them around anymore, and they thought that they might be important enough to their environment that they needed protection and needed to be saved. And so they stopped hunting them at that point. And a few years later, they discovered that there was a little remnant population right in the middle of California that was between 30 and 50 animals that were still living in that space. And that's not very many, but from that, they are the surviving southern sea otters, and they have reestablished a population that, if you're familiar with California, that goes up from about Santa Barbara to just short of San Francisco. And most along that coast there, you can find sea otters in pretty much all the habitats. Specifically in two big bays, Monterey Bay and Morro Bay, sea otter populations are very robust. There's a lot of them that live there, and that's a very good thing for a lot of reasons. Scientists have identified sea otters as something that they call a keystone species. So if you think of an arch, like what humans make when they're building like a building and they build an arch doorway, the stone that they put right at the top of that is called the keystone. And if you pull that stone out, the rest of the arch falls down. And so it's very important that that stone, because it kind of helps support the weight of all the other stones around it and helps hold everything in place. And scientists call sea otters a keystone species, meaning that they're so important to their environment that if you remove them, the rest of the ecosystem collapses. And we talked a little bit about how they live in the kelp forest, so this forest of seaweed under the water. And the sea otters are so important to that. If you pull them out, that whole ecosystem collapses. And that's because there's a creature who loves to eat kelp called a sea urchin. It's like about the size of a softball, and it's very spiky. It's very pokey all over, and it loves to eat kelp. but it specifically eats the very bottom of the kelp, the place where the kelp holds on to the seafloor or to the rocks on the bottom of the ocean. And so the sea urchin kind of crawls around, eats all this kelp, eats all this seaweed, and then the seaweed is loose, and so it drifts away with the currents, and it doesn't stay in place anymore, and it slowly dies after that. And then also all the animals that live in that rich ecosystem now don't have a home because all the seaweed has floated away. And so not a lot of animals eat sea urchins because they're covered in these big spikes, but one of the animals that does is sea otters. In fact, they eat so many of them. Most urchins along the coast of California are purple urchins, that if you look at a sea otter skull after the sea otter has died, sometimes the bones, their skeleton and their teeth are purple from eating so many sea urchins during their lifetime. And so sea urchins can also live a very long time. The purple urchins can live to be 100 years old. And so one urchin in its life can eat entire acres of seaweed, or at least the bottom parts, and the seaweed would float away, causing destruction to the environment. Scientists have learned, as we've watched the sea otter population slowly come back, that when there's more sea otters, there's more seaweed, and when there's more seaweed, all those other animals that live in the kelp forest benefit from that. So then there's more crabs, and then there's more abalone, there's more octopus and squid, and a lot of those things are things we like to eat too. So it's beneficial to us if we have the sea otters around because the ecosystem's healthier and there's a lot more diversity in the wildlife that lives there. Now, with the sea otter population today, there's about 3,000 of the southern sea otters. The population up in Alaska, up far in Alaska, is doing quite healthy, but those are genetically a little different. They get a bit bigger, they eat different things. This subpopulation over in Russia and Japan still is pretty endangered as well. So as a species, they're still listed as endangered, and 3,000 sounds like a decent number, but they estimate that it was probably in the tens of millions when explorers first explored the West Coast. And like I mentioned earlier, they lived all the way from Mexico all the way up through Alaska over to Russia and Japan and Korea. So there used to be a whole lot more of them than the little pockets where they live now. Now, there are some people who are doing a lot of good things to help out with sea otters, and that's our special shout out today, the Monterey Bay Aquarium. They are the worldwide experts in taking care of sea otters. And in fact, they coordinate sea otters for any zoo or aquarium that has sea otters, got them from the Monterey Bay Aquarium and from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So all sea otters technically belong to the government of the United States. They are listed as an endangered species since 1977. And the U.S. government and Monterey Bay Aquarium work in conjunction, hand in hand together, to help coordinate the sea otters that live in aquariums and zoos throughout the United States. The aquarium that I work for, the Aquarium of the Pacific, recently upped its role in helping the Monterey Bay Aquarium to take care of sea otters. For years, the Monterey Bay Aquarium has run a very special program that is a surrogacy program. When they find a sea otter pup that's alone, and it's alone for many, many hours, like obviously its mom is gone, it either got lost or drifted away, or its mom got hurt, injured, or possibly eaten by a predator, and that sea otter baby would die if somebody doesn't help. They figured out what they can do is bring it to the Monterey Bay Aquarium and give that baby sea otter to a female sea otter there, and she can take care of it, and she can help teach it how to be a sea otter, teach it how to groom its fur, teach it how to hunt. Even though she lives at the aquarium, they've kept some of their hunting instincts. And then when the baby's ready, they can re-release it out into the wild. And they've been able to successfully do that for about the last 20 years or so. And the aquarium I work for in Long Beach, California, has recently joined to be that level of surrogacy program with Monterey Bay. So they're hoping to be able to add on to the aquarium in Long Beach to build a special facility where they can do that, which is good and exciting news. Now, I also mentioned that there's another otter species that lives in the ocean environment, and that is called a marine otter, and they live in South America. So they live off the coast of Peru and Chile, and a little tiny bit in very southern Argentina. Um, so I didn't know much about this species, so I spent a decent amount of time today learning about them so I could share with you about them today. I kind of assumed that if they also live in the ocean, that they may also be kind of related to these ones that live up here in California and Alaska. Not the case. They're actually much closer related to the freshwater otters that live in other parts of South America, and even the freshwater otters in North America are closer related than the sea otters are. So kind of interesting how science and genetics tie different species together. But the marine otters, they actually spend a decent amount of time on land. They will sleep on the land, they have their babies on the land, and they have a little den that they go to sleep, and that's where the babies are for the first few weeks until they teach their babies how to swim. They also are quite small, so they're only about 13 pounds. They're only about 3 feet in length, so they're one of the smallest otter species. And they're a little better about moving on land. They can climb rocks really well, and so their den is sometimes up on the shore in a big pile of rocks. They also think that the marine otters are monogamous. So that means a male and a female otter stay together for most of their life, and they're a breeding couple. They kind of have a little territory that they'll definitely defend their den and some of their food resources from other otters nearby. They also will both help take care of the babies. And with that, they're able to have more babies at one time. So they typically have between 2 and 4 babies, and the babies stay up in the den while the mom and the dad go out hunting, and then they bring back food for them. And then when the babies are about 2 to maybe 3 months old, they start carrying them down to the ocean and teaching them how to swim. They are also listed as endangered, and a lot of the same threats for the sea otters are what the marine otters face as well. The marine otters will eat some fish, but they do also love to eat a lot of the same species that the sea otters do. So crabs, sea snails, different kinds of invertebrates, things like shrimp, squid, octopus, sea urchins too. So they eat a lot of those, but they do eat some fish, and they're a little faster swimmers for sure. So some of the threats that the marine otters and the sea otters face, they both have had a bad history of people hunting them for their furs. That is true also with some of the land-dwelling otters or the river otters in both Europe and North America as well. And they both struggle from pollution. So that's things like fertilizers and pesticides that we use on land to grow crops, to get rid of things like insects or rodents like mice and rats that may cause harm to crops. Some of those poisons get into the food chain, and they get into the water supply. So then they get washed down in the rivers and out into the ocean. Well, some of the animals that sea otters and the marine otters eat are things like clams. And a clam or an oyster or a mussel, any of those, they kind of function the same. They have 2 shells that close them together. They crack that shell open just a tiny bit, and then they kind of pump water through their shell, and they just eat any little tiny nutritious thing that floats through them, through their shell. That's called a filter feeder. But the problem with that is that as they're filtering in good stuff, they also get bad stuff, and they absorb a lot of that bad stuff. And then whatever eats the clam or the oyster or the mussel also gets some of that bad stuff. And that has caused problems for both marine otters and sea otters, where we've seen a lot of chemicals get traced into the food web and into the otters as a top predator. Another problem that they've had is habitat loss. And this is true with the otters in California as well. People see a nice part of property along the coastline and they think, oh, this would be a really great place to build a restaurant, or condos, or a hotel, or a golf course, or a beach resort. And that has happened in places in South America where the marine otters live, as well as places along the coast in California. And when humans develop along the coastline, they rarely think of the animals that are impacted by that, Although with the Endangered Species Act, that is something that is actually put into the law that they have to do. Although there are efforts to dismantle the Endangered Species Act, and that would cause further problems for any of these animals that are still struggling to survive. A big problem for both those kind of otters also is fishing gear. So sometimes as people are fishing, they may get a snag on their fishing line and it may break. Well, that hook and that line are still out there in the ocean somewhere. And sometimes that ends up getting stuck in the otter or wrapped around the otter's fur or neck or foot, and that can cause all sorts of health problems. Also, using things like big nets to catch different types of animals often catches things like marine mammals. They always have to come back to the surface. An otter can only hold its breath for about 5 to maybe 7 minutes. So if they get caught in a net, if they don't get free really quickly, they're going to drown. And so fishing gear is always a problem with many marine animals. Well, I hope you've enjoyed what I've shared with you today. There are ways you can help out otters. One of the best things that you can do is limit your carbon footprint. So what that means is when you're driving your car, if your car uses gasoline, which most cars still do, try to group all the errands you need to run together and do it all in one trip. So go to the grocery store, go to Target, go to the post office, go to wherever you need to go all at one time. That way you're not driving back and forth to your house so much, you're not burning as much gasoline, you're causing less pollution, which causes our planet to overheat. So that's an easy way we can all make a little difference. Also, using less energy at home can make a big difference. A lot of places are still burning things like coal or natural gas to make electricity. And so if we use less electricity, that can help out as well. So turning off lights, conserving water is also a big thing, especially in places like Southern California where we sometimes don't have a lot of water and sometimes have drought conditions. Also, switching what you eat can make a big difference. Food that uses a lot of pesticides or fertilizers can have a big impact, like I mentioned, on the otter population. And so switching to things that are a little more organic can make a big difference. And also switching away from things like beef. To raise cows to grow beef to make hamburgers or steaks is a very costly and time-consuming operation, and it has a big negative impact on the environment. The cows pooping, growing the hay to feed the cows, all of that can make bigger problems for the rest of the environment and the area around. And with everything, especially in coastal communities, any of that gets washed into a river when it rains, and then it goes out into the ocean and can cause lots of problems. So switching to healthier food choices for us can also be healthier for the otters and many of the ocean-dwelling animals out there. Well, I hope you've enjoyed what I've shared with you today about our friends, the sea otters, and their distant cousins, the marine otters. I'll be putting up some more information later today on Facebook, and this full episode will go up on Facebook and on YouTube. And until tomorrow, take care, be safe, be smart, be healthy, be happy. And feel free to like, follow, share, and subscribe to Zoo Nerd on any of those platforms, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. See you tomorrow. Take care.